The forest has always been a place where civilization meets the unknown, where daylight fades into shadow, and familiar sounds give way to something else. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 true stories from people who ventured into the woods and encountered things that changed them forever. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real experiences from real people who lived to tell about it. Let's begin. Story 1. The Watcher in the Pines. Sarah had always considered herself an experienced hiker. At 28, she'd conquered trails across 3 states, always prepared, always confident. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened during a solo camping trip in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State last October. She'd chosen a remote trail, one that required a 2-hour drive down increasingly narrow dirt roads. The kind of place where cell phone towers were a distant memory and the nearest person was probably 50 miles away. That isolation was exactly what she was looking for after a stressful month at work. The first day went perfectly. Clear skies, crisp autumn air, and the kind of silence that only exists deep in the wilderness. She set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. As darkness fell, she built a small fire and settled in for what she expected to be a peaceful night. The watching forest. That's when she first noticed the feeling. It started as a subtle sensation, like when someone stares at you from across a room. Sarah looked around the firelight's perimeter, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Just shadows dancing between the pines. She shook it off as typical camping paranoia, that primal fear that kicks in when you're truly alone in the wild. But the feeling persisted. Around 10 p.m., she heard it. A soft rustling sound from somewhere beyond the fire's glow. Not the random noise of a small animal or wind through branches. This was deliberate. Rhythmic. Like footsteps on fallen leaves. "Hello," Sarah called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is someone there?" The rustling stopped immediately. Sarah waited, heart pounding, but heard nothing more. She convinced herself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. She banked the fire and retreated to her tent, zipping it closed with shaking hands. Inside her sleeping bag, every sound seemed amplified. The canvas of her tent rustled with each breath of wind. Branches creaked overhead. But underneath it all, she could swear she heard something else. Soft, almost imperceptible sounds of movement circling her campsite. She lay awake for hours, clutching her flashlight, telling herself it was just her imagination. Eventually, exhaustion won out and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. She woke to complete silence. Not the normal silence of early morning in the forest, but an absolute, unnatural quiet. No bird songs. No insects buzzing. No wind in the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Sarah unzipped her tent flap and peered out. The morning light filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across her campsite. Everything appeared normal, exactly as she'd left it the night before. Except for the footprints. They were everywhere, circling her tent in a perfect ring, pressed deep into the soft earth. But these weren't animal tracks. They were human footprints. Bare feet by the look of them. Large, with unusually long toes. Sarah's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone, knowing there was no signal but hoping against hope. Nothing. She was completely cut off from the outside world. The logical part of her mind tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe another camper had walked through during the night. But that didn't explain the complete circle around her tent, or why someone would be walking barefoot through the forest at night. She packed up camp as quickly as possible, hands shaking as she stuffed her gear into her backpack. Every few seconds, she'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone watching her. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming now, pressing down on her like a physical weight. As she shouldered her pack and started down the trail toward her car, she heard it again. The rustling sound from the night before. But now it seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if she was being surrounded. Sarah broke into a run. She crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at her clothes and face. Behind her, the rustling grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like multiple figures moving through the forest, keeping pace with her but staying just out of sight. She ran for what felt like hours, taking wrong turns, doubling back, completely lost in her panic. When she finally stumbled onto the main trail that led back to her car, The sound stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. The forest fell silent again. Sarah made it to her car and drove away without looking back. She never reported what happened, knowing how crazy it would sound. But she did some research when she got home, diving into old newspaper archives and local folklore. What she found chilled her to the bone. The area where she'd camped had a history. Native American tribes had considered it sacred and dangerous. There were stories dating back over a century about people who'd ventured too deep into those particular woods and come back changed, or not come back at all. More recently, there had been reports from other hikers. Sightings of tall, thin figures moving between the trees. Always just at the edge of vision. Always watching. Sarah never went camping alone again. But sometimes, even now, she wakes up in the middle of the night with the overwhelming sensation that something is watching her through her bedroom window. When she looks out, she sees only darkness between the suburban trees. But she can't shake the feeling that something followed her home from those woods. Story 2. The cabin that shouldn't exist. Marcus and his brother Jake had been planning their hunting trip for months. Every October, they drive up to the same remote area in northern Michigan, set up camp, and spend a week tracking white-tailed deer through the dense hardwood forests. It was a tradition that went back to their childhood, when their father had first taken them into these same woods. But this year was different. They'd been hunting the area for over 15 years and knew every trail, every landmark, every abandoned hunting blind. The forest held no surprises for them anymore. Or so they thought. It was their third day when they decided to explore a section of woods they'd never investigated before. It lay beyond a steep ridge that they'd always assumed led nowhere interesting. But with deer scarce in their usual spots, they figured it was worth checking out. The climb up the ridge was steeper than it looked. By the time they reached the top, both brothers were winded and sweating despite the crisp autumn air. The view from the ridgeline was spectacular. Miles of unbroken forest stretching to the horizon, painted in brilliant reds and golds. But what caught their attention wasn't the view. It was the cabin. It sat in a small clearing about half a mile down the far side of the ridge. A simple log structure with a stone chimney and what looked like a covered porch. Smoke was rising from the chimney, indicating someone was home. "I didn't know there were any cabins back here," Jake said, adjusting his binoculars for a better look. Marcus shook his head. "There aren't. I've been hunting these woods since I was 12. There's never been a cabin in this area." They studied it for several minutes, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The cabin looked old, like it had been there for decades. But that was impossible. They knew this forest like their own backyard. "Maybe it's on private land," Jake suggested. "Could be we just never noticed it before. From up here. No way. We would have seen it." They decided to investigate. The descent down the far side of the ridge was treacherous, with loose rocks and fallen logs creating obstacles every few yards. It took them nearly an hour to reach the clearing where the cabin sat. Up close, it was even more puzzling. The logs were weathered and gray with age, covered in patches of moss. The chinking between the logs was done in the old style, with mud and small stones. This wasn't some weekend retreat built by wealthy city folks. This was an old-fashioned homestead cabin, the kind settlers might have built 150 years ago. But the smoke rising from the chimney was definitely real. "Hello," Marcus called out as they approached the porch. "Anyone home?" No response. They climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch, their boots echoing hollowly on the weathered planks. The front door was solid wood, painted dark green but now faded and peeling. There were no windows facing the front of the cabin. Jake knocked firmly on the door. "Hello. We're hunters from the other side of the ridge. Just wanted to introduce ourselves." Still nothing. They waited for several minutes, but heard no movement from inside. Marcus walked around to the side of the cabin, looking for windows. He found 2, but they were too high to see through clearly. What he could make out showed a dim interior with what looked like simple wooden furniture. "This is really weird," he said when he returned to the porch. "Someone's definitely in there. The fire's going strong. But they're not answering." Jake tried the door handle. It turned easily. "We can't just go in," Marcus protested. "Just a quick look. Make sure whoever's in there is okay. What if they're hurt or something?" Before Marcus could object further, Jake pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a single room, simply furnished with handmade wooden chairs and tables. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Oil lamps provided additional light, though none were currently lit. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something organic and unpleasant. But the cabin was empty. "Hello," Jake called again, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Is anyone here?" They explored the small space quickly. There was a sleeping area in one corner with a simple cot covered by rough blankets. A small kitchen area with a hand pump for water. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved food and other supplies. Everything looked authentic, as if the cabin had been continuously occupied for decades. But there was no sign of whoever had built the fire. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered. "Look at this stuff. These preserving jars, the furniture, it's all antique. But someone was just here." Jake picked up one of the jars from a shelf. The label was handwritten in faded ink, "Venison, October 1923. Other jars bore similar dates, all from the 1920s and 1930s. "This has got to be some kind of historical recreation," Jake said. "Maybe the Forest Service maintains it as an educational site or something." But Marcus was looking at the fireplace. The logs were fresh, recently added. Coals glowed bright orange beneath them. This fire had been tended within the last hour. "We need to get out of here," he said suddenly. "What? Why?" "Look at the fire, Jake. Someone was just here. And I mean just here. Those logs haven't been burning long." As if to emphasize his point, one of the logs shifted and settled deeper into the flames, sending up a shower of sparks. They left quickly, closing the door behind them. But as they walked across the clearing toward the ridge, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. He glanced back at the cabin several times, expecting to see someone in the doorway or at one of the windows. The climb back up the ridge seemed to take forever. When they finally reached the top and looked back down at the clearing, both brothers froze. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood just an hour before, there was now only forest. Tall pines and hardwood trees filled the clearing as if they'd been growing there for decades. "What the hell?" Jake whispered. They spent another hour on the ridge line, using binoculars to search every inch of the area below. There was no cabin, no clearing, no sign that either had ever existed. But Marcus could still smell wood smoke on his clothing. They never spoke about what happened to anyone else, knowing how insane it would sound. But they did some research when they got home. What they found in the local Historical Society archives made their blood run cold. In 1924, a homesteader named William Cortez had built a cabin in that exact area. He'd lived there alone for nearly 10 years, trapping and hunting to survive. In the winter of 1933, during one of the worst blizzards on record, neighbors had gone to check on him. They found his cabin empty, the fire still burning in the fireplace. William Cortez was never seen again. Search parties combed the area for weeks but found no trace of him. According to the records, his cabin had been torn down by the county in 1934. Marcus and Jake never went hunting in that area again. But sometimes, on quiet October evenings, they both swear they can still smell wood smoke drifting through their windows, even though they live in the city now, miles from the nearest fireplace. Story 3. The Thing That Mimics. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a biology professor at the State University, specializing in forest ecosystems. She'd spent countless hours in wilderness areas conducting research, documenting plant and animal behavior, collecting samples. The forest was her laboratory, her sanctuary, her second home. So when the university approved her grant proposal for a 2-week solo research expedition in the Olympic National Forest, she was thrilled. The project involved studying the effects of climate change on old-growth tree populations, work that required long hours alone in the deep woods, taking measurements and photographs. She set up her base camp in a remote valley, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The nearest road was 8 miles away. The nearest person, probably much farther than that. The first week went perfectly. Her research was proceeding ahead of schedule, and she was gathering data that would strengthen her upcoming paper significantly. The weather had been cooperative, and she'd seen plenty of wildlife, deer, rabbits, even a black bear that watched her curiously from a distance before ambling away. But on the 8th day, something changed. Jennifer first noticed it while she was photographing a particularly old cedar tree, using her measuring tape to document its circumference. She heard her name being called from somewhere in the forest behind her. Jennifer! Jennifer, where are you? It sounded like her research assistant, David. But that was impossible. David was back at the university, probably teaching his undergraduate lab section. Besides, he had no idea where she was camping. "Hello," she called back. "Who's there?" The voice came again, from a different direction this time. "Jennifer, I've been looking for you." It definitely sounded like David's voice. The same tone, the same slight accent from his childhood in Boston. But something about it seemed off, like someone doing a very good imitation. Jennifer packed up her equipment and headed back toward her campsite, constantly looking over her shoulder. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, but she never saw anyone following her. That night, as she sat by her small camp stove eating dinner, she heard the voice again. "Jennifer, where did you go? I need to find you." This time it was coming from just outside the ring of light cast by her lantern, close enough that she should be able to see whoever was speaking. But there was no one there. "David," she called tentatively. "David, is that really you? How did you find me?" "I've been walking all day," the voice replied. It was definitely David's voice, but the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm so tired, Jennifer. Can I come into your camp?" Jennifer's blood ran cold. Something about the request felt wrong, predatory. And there was something else bothering her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Then it hit her. David never called her Jennifer. In the 3 years he'd been her research assistant, he'd always called her Dr. Walsh or just Document. He was too respectful of academic hierarchy to use her first name. "David," she said carefully, "what's the name of the tree species we've been studying in Lab 3? There was a long pause. Then, "Jennifer, why are you asking me questions? I'm tired. I need to rest." Jennifer's heart was racing now. David would have known the answer immediately. They'd spent weeks discussing Douglas fir genetics in that lab. "I don't think you're David," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The voice changed then. Became angry, frustrated. But it was still David's voice. "Of course I'm David. Jennifer, let me into your camp. I'm cold and I need help." "No," Jennifer said firmly. "I want you to leave." What happened next would haunt her dreams for months. The voice began to change, cycling through different people she knew. Her mother's voice. "Jenny, honey, why won't you help me?" Her ex-husband's voice. "Come on, Jen, don't be like this." Her department head's voice. "Dr. Walsh, I need to speak with you immediately." Each voice was perfect, indistinguishable from the real person. But they were all saying things those people would never say, asking her to come out of her camp, to join them in the darkness beyond her lantern's glow. Jennifer grabbed her satellite phone and tried to call for help, but couldn't get a signal through the forest canopy. She was truly alone with whatever was out there. The voices continued through the night, sometimes speaking simultaneously, creating a horrible chorus of familiar people saying wrong things. Her sister's voice pleaded with her to come home. Her graduate advisor invited her to a meeting that didn't exist. Her best friend from childhood begged her to come play. Jennifer didn't sleep. She sat in the center of her camp, lantern burning bright, clutching a can of bear spray and waiting for dawn. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the trees, the voices finally stopped. The forest returned to its normal sounds, birds singing, insects buzzing, wind in the branches. But Jennifer's ordeal wasn't over. As she packed up her equipment, preparing to hike back to her car and abandon the research trip, she heard footsteps approaching through the forest. Human footsteps, accompanied by a familiar whistle. Her father appeared at the edge of the clearing, wearing his favorite fishing hat and carrying an old backpack. He looked exactly as she remembered him, down to the slight limp from an old hiking injury. "There you are, kiddo," he said with a warm smile. "I've been looking all over for you." Jennifer felt tears spring to her eyes. Her father had died of cancer 2 years ago. She'd held his hand as he passed away in the hospital. "Dad," she whispered. Come on, Jenny. Time to go home. Your mother's worried about you. The figure looked perfect in every detail. Same weathered face, same gentle eyes, same way of holding his shoulders. But Jennifer noticed something that made her blood freeze. Her father cast no shadow. The morning sun was streaming through the trees, creating sharp shadows everywhere. Every tree, every rock, every piece of equipment in her camp cast a clear shadow on the forest floor. But the thing that looked like her father cast none. "You're not my dad," Jennifer said, backing away. The figure's smile never wavered. "Of course I am, kiddo. Don't you recognize your old man? My father is dead. Death is just another place, Jenny. Come with me and you'll understand." Jennifer ran. She left most of her equipment behind, grabbing only her backpack and water bottle. Behind her, she could hear her father's voice calling her name, pleading with her to come back, to not leave him alone in the forest. But she didn't look back. The 8-mile hike to her car took less than 3 hours. She drove straight through to the university, not stopping until she was surrounded by concrete and streetlights and the comfortable noise of civilization. Jennifer never returned to finish her research. She told her department that she'd encountered equipment problems and bad weather, technical difficulties that made the data unreliable. They accepted her explanation without question. But she did file an informal report with the Park Service, suggesting that the area be monitored for unusual activity. The ranger she spoke with listened politely and thanked her for the information. What he didn't tell her was that she was the 4th person in 2 years to report similar encounters in that valley. The Park Service had quietly closed several trails in the area, citing environmental concerns. Jennifer transferred to a different university the following semester, taking a position that focused on urban forestry instead of wilderness research. She still studies trees, but never alone, and never more than a few miles from the nearest road. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, she still hears her father's voice calling her name. When she looks out her window, she sees only empty streets and parked cars. But she never opens the window to answer. 3 stories. 3 encounters with something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The forest has always been a place of mystery, where the familiar rules of our civilized world seem to bend and break. Sarah learned that some places are watched by things that don't want to be disturbed. Marcus and Jake discovered that time itself can become fluid in the deep woods. And Dr. Walsh found out that the forest sometimes wears familiar faces to lure us into the unknown. The question isn't whether these things are real. The question is, what's waiting in the woods near you? Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. And remember, the next time you're alone in the forest and hear something calling your name, make sure you know who's doing the calling before you answer. Sweet dreams.